would it be possible to give Angel Rodriguez recording permission?
Done.
Thank you.
This round is good to begin. All right, this is the all clear. You can begin the round.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I think the first thing, excuse me, I'm new to this kind of technical stuff, but let me give you some instructions before we begin, if everybody's present. Let's call the case of the estates of Genesis Petrillo versus Peony Estates and Harper Martini. My name is Judge Gonzalez. Scoring judge, please look to the two buttons on the lower left of your screen and remember to keep your audio and video off unless you are told otherwise. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants. This means the only people on the screen right now should be the advocates and me. Can the attorneys please make appearances? Can you please identify yourself for everybody?
Good morning. My name is Cinque Garza.
Anybody else for plaintiffs?
My name is Jasper Desi.
Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Hayden Tyner.
Anybody else for plaintiffs? Let's go with defense. Defense, please identify yourself for the record.
Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Matthew York, and I am joined here today by my co-counsels, Ms. Rachel Polk.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
Mr. Krishna Kunderi.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
Together, we are advocating on behalf of the defendant, Ms. Harper Martini.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning. Thank you. Okay, we're ready to proceed. We'll now hear opening statements from each party. Everyone should make sure they are in speaker view. That button is the upper right of your screen. Attorneys, please remember to make your audio, to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking. So plaintiffs, if you are present and you are ready to proceed, please proceed with opening.
Your Honor, may we begin with pretrial matters?
Yes, I'm sorry. Please go. Any pretrial matters take up before opening.
Your Honor, my name is Cinque Garza, and I, along with my co-counsels, Jess Valdezi and Hayden Tyner, represent Joey Petrillo as the administrator of the estate of Genesis Petrillo, pursuing the cause of action of battery against Harper Martini. Your Honor, before we begin, we have a few pretrial matters we would like to address. First, the plaintiff moves to invoke Rule 603, which states all witnesses have been pre-sworn prior to their testimony.
Granted.
The plaintiff also moves to invoke Rule 615, which states that all witnesses are to be constructively sequestered.
Granted.
What are your Honor's preferences about movement during statements in examinations?
I mean, we're doing this via Zoom, so I have no issues with everybody sitting where they're at and just making objections as they come up and making any arguments from seated positions.
What are your Honor's preferences about sharing our screen for evidentiary purposes?
Yes, I mean, once yeah, I mean, I don't know how it's in a setting, to be honest with you, but yes, I mean, you need to share everything, share it with me. I have been emailed all evidence, so when it's going to be shown, just tell me which exhibits they are, be clear so I can view them on my screen and make appropriate rulings.
May we assume all evidentiary arguments are heard outside the earshot of the jury?
Yes.
To note for the court, exhibits 1 through 10 are pre-admitted into evidence per stipulation 3.
Is that correct, defense?
Yes, Your Honor.
They shall be admitted?
May we assume that anything being screen shared beyond exhibits 1 through 10 is not published to the jury until it has been entered into evidence?
Yes.
Finally, Your Honor, we have a few documents to tender to the bench. These include the complaint, answer, stipulations, pretrial order, case law, available law, Midland's rules of evidence, and special instructions. These will be put into the Zoom chat for opposing counsel to review and for tendering to the bench. With that, the plaintiff is ready to proceed.
Okay, thank you. Defense, any pretrial issues?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, I would just like to draw your attention to some case law. Burdett v. Copenhagen. This just defines the elements of civil battery are: number 1, an act by a defendant; number 2, an intent to cause harmful or offensive contact on the part of the defendant; and number 3, harmful or offensive contact to the plaintiff.
Thank you.
And I'd also like to draw attention to the case Defendifer v. Schroeder. In this case, the court ruled that the burden of proof for such a civil case is by a preponderance of evidence and lies solely on the plaintiff, not on the defense.
So noted.
And with that, the defense is ready to proceed.
All right, thank you very much. Plaintiff, you may proceed with opening statements.
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. The defendant walked in with poison and walked out with wine. This is Genesis Petrillo, and as you'll hear today, she was a beautiful young woman in the prime of her life, ready to get married with her best friend and begin their new lives together. But this dream was cut short when she drank the poisoned wine the night before her wedding and slipped into coma, passing away right as she was supposed to be zipping up her wedding dress, adjusting her veil, and walking down the aisle. Members of the jury, what happened? The defendant, Harper Martini, Genesis' future mother-in-law, killed her. The defendant walked in with poison and walked out with wine. And now Genesis Petrillo is dead. Now let's take a step back. What happened? The night before, Genesis had just received a bottle of wine named Cara from the defendant, Harper Martini, Genesis' soon-to-be-in-law. And Genesis wanted to celebrate her night because she was about to get married with her best friend. So she drank the bottle of Cara. But sip after sip, she started to get sick. And today you'll hear from Miss Petrio's bridesmaid, who saw Genesis getting sick and then rushed her to the hospital. The bridesmaid will tell her how she waited and waited for some good news, but soon found out that Genesis was in a coma. The doctor who treated Genesis Petrio will take the stand to testify that the cause of Genesis' coma and eventual death was pesticide poisoning. The bridesmaid will tell you how she rushed back to the wedding venue to get Genesis' fiance, Casey Soto. And Casey Soto will take the stand to testify how she and her bridesmaid rushed back to the hospital only to find out they were too late. Just 5 minutes before Casey arrived, Genesis had died from pesticide poisoning. How did Genesis get pesticide poisoning? It's because the defendant walked in with poison and walked out with wine. Members of the jury, the evidence will show you that it was the defendant. And Casey Soto will tell you that the defendant, Genesis' future mother-in-law, never liked Genesis from the beginning, hated her even. The bridesmaid will tell you about the constant fighting that occurred all the way up till the time of the wedding. And as a matter of fact, the bridesmaid saw the defendant with a canister of pesticide walking towards the kitchen. And when the bridesmaid asked the defendant, "What's the canister for?" the defendant will then reply that these pesticides are for Genesis because Genesis is such a pest. The defendant walked in with poison and walked out with wine. And that is why today we as a plaintiff are pursuing a complaint of battery against Harper Martini. You have to prove that the defendant took an action with intent to cause harm to Genesis. That is that she intentionally put poison in the wine that ultimately caused Genesis' death. And we have to prove this to you today by a preponderance of evidence. That is that it is more likely than not that the defendant committed battery against Genesis Petrio. The defendant walked in with poison and walked out with wine. So at the end of today's trial, my co-counsel, Mr. Tyner, will come before you and review all the evidence that you heard today. And throughout this trial, I ask you to consider all the evidence with an open mind so that you'll be able to arrive to the truth. And when Mr. Tyner asks you the verdict of liable, I anticipate that you'll be able to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Defense, you may proceed with your opening statement.
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court. Opposing counsel, members of the jury, there is no intent and an accident. Today we are here because the plaintiff is accusing a mother, Harper Martini, of poisoning her only child's fiance, Genesis Petrio. This is far from the reality of today's case. Instead, Harper Martini is helping her child grieve the death of their fiance, which is one of the worst pains a mother could watch their child experience. You see, the plaintiff's story is missing something. What took place on June 8th, 2019 was tragic, and no one could have foreseen this tragic outcome because, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there is no intent and an accident. Raising a child as a single mom is never easy. But Harper still managed to be Casey's biggest fan, attending every school play and soccer game that she ever had. Once Casey was older, she met her fiance, Genesis Petrio. Now, initially, Harper and Genesis didn't have the best relationship, as many other relationships people have with their in-laws. But Harper still tried her best for Casey's happiness. She even offered to host their wedding at her winery, Peony Estates. Harper spent months planning the wedding and never meant for anything to go wrong on such a special day, because members of the jury, there was no intent and an accident. Harper's winery, Peony Estates, had been dealing with the pest problem because it's located near a swamp. Now, it's no secret that this pest problem caused some problems for her business, as the employees sometimes kept pesticide in the wine bottling area. While it is true the employees of Peony Estates were sometimes careless with their practices, Harper Martini was not, and did not intend on the harming of Genesis Petrio. The evidence will show that on the night of the rehearsal dinner, Harper was so eager to make amends with Genesis that she offered her a bottle of Cara wine. Genesis happily accepted this wine and enjoyed several glasses of it, even offering a glass of wine to another member of the wedding party, Angel Rodriguez, who did not become sick. But once she became noticeably too drunk, she was rushed to the hospital. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, evidence will show that we don't know if it was poison that killed Genesis Petrillo. But even if it was due to the inattentive practices of Peony Estates, not Harper's anger. You will hear testimony today from 3 witnesses that will show you that Harper never intended to harm her soon-to-be daughter-in-law. First, you will hear from Austin Lewis, a Peony Estates employee who will tell you that Peony Estates had questionable practices and were given several citations from their health inspector. Next, you will hear from Dr. Cannon, who will offer several other explanations for Genesis's death and show that Harper's actions could not have caused it. And last, you will hear from Miss Martini herself, who will tell you that she never consistently held negative feelings toward Genesis, and she really worked to improve their relationship, proving that there was no intent to harm Genesis. As you listen to the testimonies today, listen to the problematic practices of Peony Estates. Listen to the several alternative explanations for Genesis's death, and listen to the lack of intent to harm Harper had for Genesis Petrillo, which the plaintiff will fail to provide. Members of the jury, for the plaintiff to find Miss Martini liable for battery, they must prove 3 elements. 1, there's an act committed by Miss Martini. 2, there is an intent to harm Genesis Petrillo. And 3, that there is harmful contact from Miss Martini to Genesis. They will not be able to prove any of these elements because today's case was an unforeseen accident. And there is no intent when an accident happens. At the end of this trial, the plaintiff will be unable to meet their burden of proving battery, and that is why my co-counsel, Christian Kunduri, will come before you and ask that you find Harper Martini not liable. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Polk. Just for instructions, before the plaintiff calls his first witness, I'll ask everyone to switch to gallery view. That button is in the upper right of your screen. This will allow you to see the attorneys and witnesses at the same time. If we're ready to proceed, plaintiffs, please call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. We would like to call Angel Rodriguez to the stand.
Okay, Angel Rodriguez, please take the stand.
Now, please introduce yourself to the court.
Hi, my name is Angel Rodriguez. I'm a Gemini sun with an Aquarius moon. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a kindergarten teacher.
Do you know why you're in court here today?
Oh, yes. One of my best friends, Genesis Petrillo, well, her soul passed on to the next plane.
Now, would you be able to recognize a picture of Genesis Petrillo?
Of course, yes.
Let the record reflect that I'm showing the witness and attorney, opposing counsel in turn as Exhibit 1. Now, what am I showing you?
That's a picture of Jen.
Now, does this look like a fair and accurate picture of the victim that you know?
Yeah, she looks just as beautiful as she did.
Let the record reflect that Exhibit 1 has already been entered due to stipulations, Stipulation 3. Now, do you know the defendant in today's case?
Yes, Miss Harper Martini. She was about to be Jen's mother-in-law because she's Casey, Jen's fiance's mom.
What's your knowledge of the relationship between the defendant and the victim?
Well, to my knowledge, that relationship wasn't as full of love as I might prefer. Miss Martini always seemed to be insulting or criticizing Jen, and it all just sort of culminated on the day of the rehearsal dinner.
Now, what happened on the day of the rehearsal dinner?
The energy just seemed really bad to me that day. Miss Martini and Jen were fighting about everything. I even heard Miss Martini tell Jen that she should just leave and save this family a headache. Otherwise, I will make you disappear.
And what happened next?
I tried to talk to Jen about it, but Miss Martini grabbed Jen's arm and yanked her into a hallway.
Now, do you know what happened in the hallway?
I don't really know. When I asked Jen about what happened, she just said, I am afraid that Harper is going to kill me if I'm not careful.
Objection, Your Honor, to the hearsay statements of Genesis Petrillo.
Response from plaintiffs?
Yes, Your Honor. This is an exception to hearsay as to Rule 8033. I am afraid goes to then existing emotional state of Genesis Petrillo. Therefore, it is not hearsay.
Response from defense?
Your Honor, Ms. Rodriguez does not have personal knowledge over whether Miss Genesis was afraid in the moment. It was simply a hearsay statement, and there's no foundation laid that there was terror when this happened.
Objection sustained. Ask the jury to disregard that last statement from Ms. Rodriguez.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, did you see the defendant again that day?
Yeah, I saw her walking toward the kitchen holding a canister of pesticides.
And what happened once you saw the defendant walking with a canister of pesticides?
I asked her what was going on. She hesitated for a few seconds, and then she quickly told me it's for Genesis, because Genesis is such a pest.
Did you see the defendant again that day?
Yeah, later that night at the rehearsal dinner, I saw her walk out with a bottle of wine. She gave it to Genesis as a gift. It was a unique bottle, a Cara bottle of wine.
Now, would you be able to recognize this bottle of Cara if I were to show you in court here today?
I would.
Let the record reflect that this bottle of Cara has already been entered due to stipulation 3.
So noted.
Now, what am I showing you?
That's the bottle that Miss Martini gave to Jen and the label that was on the bottle.
And has it been changed or altered in any way?
No, not that I can see.
And to your knowledge, did anyone drink this wine?
I saw Jen drink it, but I don't think I saw anybody else drink it. I mean, other than me. I did take a little bit of a sip, but I didn't really like it, so I spit it out.
What happened after the defendant gave the victim the bottle of wine?
Well, Jen got up to dance, but something seemed really wrong.
What do you mean that something seemed really wrong?
Well, Jen and I have gotten drunk together a lot, like a lot. So I've seen her tipsy and I've seen her wasted, but I hadn't ever seen her this out of it.
Now, what do you mean by out of it?
It was, I don't know, it was so unusual because she hadn't even finished the bottle of Cara wine, and I had seen her drink 1, maybe 2 glasses of champagne other than that. But like we were dancing to Thriller, and most of us were like, Thriller, Thriller. But Jen was like stumbling like Thriller, Thriller. It was really weird.
Now, what did you do once you saw the victim dance to Thriller?
I asked her how she was feeling, and she told me this isn't a kind of feeling that I felt before.
And what happened next?
Eventually, we took her back upstairs, but the weird thing was, even though she was stumbling up the stairs, I didn't smell any alcohol on her breath.
What happened once you took the victim upstairs?
Well, that's when everything changed. Jen was vomiting so much, and I saw the light in her aura begin to dim. And then she lost consciousness. So I freaked out and I called 911. And then the EMTs came and they were doing CPR on her. And then they loaded her into the ambulance and they drove us to the hospital.
Now, what happened at the hospital?
I just waited and I waited, hoping for some good news, asking the universe for good news, but it didn't come. In the morning, the doctors told me that Genesis had slipped into a coma.
What did you do after that?
Well, I realized that I had to tell Casey, so I rushed back to the wedding venue to try to find Casey.
And what happened once you got to the wedding venue?
Well, I actually ran into Miss Martini in the hallway on the way to Casey's room, and our interaction was honestly kind of confusing.
Now, explain to the jury, why was this confusing?
Well, I had been the only one with Jen at the hospital, and I hadn't called anyone other than Jen's parents, and they didn't pick up. So it was really confusing to me when Miss Martini said, "Genesis got poisoned. Oh no, we'll have to cancel the wedding."
No more questions, Your Honor. I pass the witness.
Okay. Ms. Polk?
Yes, may I proceed?
Yes, please.
Ms. Rodriguez, you were close with Casey and Genesis, weren't you?
Yeah, we were all really close friends, almost like soul sisters.
Yeah, y'all are so close that you were in their wedding party.
Yeah, I was their bridesmaid.
And while planning the wedding, you noticed there are some disagreements between Harper, Genesis, and Casey.
Yeah, they didn't get along much.
But the disagreements were so complicated, you couldn't tell who was mad at who, could you?
Yeah, that's right.
In fact, you even admitted that you never got the full story of what happened between them.
I know that Jen and Casey loved each other and there wasn't much going on between them, but I don't know between all three of them, yeah, the full story.
So you don't know what the arguments were about?
Not really.
And you don't know who started them?
No, Casey did complain to me that she was worried that her mom might not like Genesis, but I don't know the details.
Yes, you don't know the details. So you saw Genesis, Harper, and Casey making an effort to keep things cordial.
Yeah, they really did seem to make an effort. I mean, that's why I think maybe that Harper gave the bottle to Genesis as a gift. I thought she was making an effort to get along.
Ms. Rodriguez, you didn't even know Harper that well, did you?
I knew her more after the wedding planning process because I did, as the bridesmaid, I was a little bit involved in the planning process, and she was very involved in the wedding planning process.
Really? Because in fact, you said y'all only met once or twice, correct?
Before the wedding planning process, yeah, we had only met 1 or 2 times.
But you do know Harper was very involved in the planning of the wedding.
Yes.
She wanted it to be successful.
I don't know for sure what she wanted, but that's how it seemed.
You said she was very involved in the wedding planning, correct?
Yes.
She even offered to host the wedding at her winery, Peony Estates.
The wedding was hosted there, so I assume, yeah.
So you would agree that she cared about the success of the wedding?
I mean, I can't say for sure what she cared about.
Now, you went to the wedding party at Black Bear Casino.
Yeah, that was our last party with all of us together. I didn't realize it at the time.
And you found Genesis vomiting in the hotel bathroom.
Yeah, wouldn't be the first time.
And now you even admitted yourself that y'all drank together very often, correct?
Yeah, Jen and I, we really just like to have fun together, shed the burdens of this world.
So drinking was an unusual behavior for Genesis.
No.
It wasn't. And you attributed this vomiting in the hotel bathroom to her drinking too much that night, correct?
Yeah.
Now I want to move on to the rehearsal dinner. Harper surprised everyone by presenting Genesis with a bottle of Cara wine.
Yes, she walked out with wine.
And you saw her give Genesis this fancy bottle of wine in front of the whole wedding party.
I did. Genesis got this unique bottle with the Cara label. Harper actually gave us some bottles of wine too, but they were different. It was a Horizon wine.
Yes, Genesis' bottle was unique, and she was relieved by this gesture, happy even, right?
That's what it seemed to me, yeah.
And you saw Genesis drink this wine.
I did. I saw her pour multiple glasses of it and drink it.
Yeah, she drank multiple glasses, and you even took a sip yourself.
Yeah, she had offered everybody at the table a little bit of wine, but nobody else took any. So I did take a little bit, but I took a sip and I spit it right out. The vibes of that wine just weren't meshing with me, so I did not swallow any.
Ms. Rodriguez, you took a sip and you didn't have a lack of coordination or slurred speech,
Not more than the alcohol would have given me.
but you also didn't have several glasses of the alcohol, did you?
No, I did.
Afterwards, you saw Genesis drinking several more glasses of the wine,
Yes, I did.
and this wasn't unusual behavior for her.
No.
Objection and proper character evidence may be heard.
Yes, please. What's your objection?
To improper character evidence.
Explain.
They are trying to establish a character trait that Genesis is a drinker by showing conformity therewith.
May I
By
respond?
drinking this time.
No, I'm sorry. Go continue. I'm sorry. Let me cut you off. Are you finished? Go ahead.
No, by drinking that this moment means that she's drinking in this moment means that she's always been drinking. So they're just trying to show conformity therewith.
Okay. Defense?
Your Honor, we do not believe we've elicited any traits for Genesis Petrillo. We're simply trying to determine what normal behavior is for her. Ms. Rodriguez has testified herself that she's gone out drinking with Genesis several times and laid this foundation.
I'll objection overruled. Continue.
Yes, Your Honor. She even ordered more alcohol after, tequila shots.
She did order those shots, but I didn't see her drink any of them. I think that Drew and I finished most of those.
Afterwards, when you noticed that Genesis was getting ill, you took her to the hospital.
I called 911 and the EMTs actually took her to the hospital in an ambulance.
Yes, and the doctors told you that it was most likely due to a poisoning.
Yeah, that's what the doctors told me.
But did the doctors specify if it was pesticide or even alcohol poisoning?
Not that I remember. All I remember is they said that she slipped into a coma and attributed it to poisoning, but honestly, it's a little bit of a blur.
Yes, Ms. Rodriguez, they didn't clarify. And you never actually witnessed Harper harm Genesis, did you?
I saw Harper criticize Genesis and insult Genesis, and that seemed to make her really upset.
But Ms. Rodriguez, you would agree with me that she did not harm Genesis.
Objection speculation.
Objection. Miss Polk, just ask your question a little bit clearer.
Yes.
Specific. Objection sustained.
Ms. Rodriguez, you never witnessed Harper harm Genesis, did you?
No, I did. Her emotions and her mental health, I think, to me seemed very harmed by Miss Martini.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Desai, any redirect?
No redirect is needed. I just asked if the witness can be excused.
Okay.
Right.
Ms.
Thank you.
Rodriguez, thank you very much. You may be excused.
Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you. Plaintiffs, call your next witness.
The plaintiff calls Dr. Jimin Kwan.
Okay. You may proceed.
Please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Dr. Jimin Kwan.
Why are you here today?
I was the attending physician on June 8th, 2019, so I was the doctor that diagnosed and treated Genesis Petrillo on the night of her death.
What exactly do you do for a living?
I'm the chief emergency physician at my hospital, so my job is to assess the patients that walk into the emergency room and provide an initial diagnosis and help guide their treatment plan.
And where were you educated for this?
I went to medical school at UNC Chapel Hill, and then I completed my fellowship and my residency at Emory.
Can you tell the court a little about your work experience since then?
Of course, I've been working as an emergency physician and emergency room doctor for almost 17 years now. I've been rising through the ranks until my most recent promotion in 2015 when I was promoted to the chief.
Regarding this case in particular, doctor, What exactly did you examine?
I examined the patient, Genesis Petrillo.
What evidence did you rely on in conducting your examination?
Well, of course, I examined the patient's physical body and also the symptoms that I learned from her. And I also looked at her toxicology reports, her death certificate, and other exhibits like that.
Was this sufficient for you to reach your conclusions?
Yes, ma'am. That's all that we have in the emergency room.
What about your methods, doctor? How did you research your conclusions?
Well, when you're in my job, the pressure is on. So we have to make tough calls and initial diagnoses quickly so that we can get the proper care to patients in an emergency state. So what we use, we call it the symptoms complex method of differential diagnosis. What that means basically is that we just look at symptoms in groups instead of individually, because that helps us get a more holistic idea of what the diagnosis is that we're actually working with. Take an example. If someone comes into my emergency room and tells me they have a headache, I could diagnose them with stress, the flu, or even something as serious as a brain aneurysm.
Your Honor, the witness has launched into a narrative, if I may be heard.
Yes, go ahead, please.
The witness has gone far beyond what her method is and has gone into examples and detailed explanations which are beyond the scope of the question that the attorney asked.
Okay. Sustained. Plaintiff, Ms. Garza, just ask, break up your question a little bit more, and so that we won't have any narrative going on. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. You may proceed.
In your method, what is the steps that you take to reach your conclusions to your diagnosis?
So the first step that I take is I look at the symptom complex. I look at the group. For example, if I see a symptom complex of a fever, body aches, and a stuffy nose, then I know that we're going to be more in the flu realm than if I just look at the individual diagnosis of a headache, for example. So these steps are just the most efficient and reliable way to diagnose these patients and guide the direction of their treatment. Because after I look at these symptoms, I make these diagnoses and then I recommend the treatment.
Is this method reliable?
Yes, ma'am. It's been peer-reviewed, tested. It's the gold standard in our field, and everyone that I know at the hospital uses it.
And were you able to reliably apply the facts and data of today's case to your method?
Yes, ma'am, I was.
So walk us through what happened when the victim arrived at your emergency room.
This is when I begin the diagnosis process and I take note of the patient's initial symptoms and create that first complex.
What were these symptoms?
They were symptoms generally seeming to reflect intoxication. For example, the patient smelled like wine and exhibited symptoms such as slurred speech, nausea, and vomiting. She had a hard time responding to my questions, which is another important fact. And she did manage to inform me, though, that she had been drinking that night.
Objection, Your Honor, hearsay, if I may be heard.
Proceed.
Genesis Petrillo's testimony as to that she's been drinking that night is hearsay. It's an out-of-court statement, and they're using it to prove the truth of the matter asserted, that she was drinking.
Response from plaintiffs?
Yes, Your Honor. In Rule 8034, it does call for the statement for purposes of medical diagnosis or treatment, and therefore a reasonably pertinent to diagnosis or treatment. So the witness is just testifying that it's, not for the truth, but for before the purposes of diagnosing, getting to the diagnosis of the client, and that's eliminating the factors.
If I may respond?
Sure, go ahead.
I believe that they are using it for the truth of the matter asserted that Genesis was drinking. And it's the fact that Genesis was drinking is not a medical diagnosis. It is a part of a medical diagnosis. And I don't believe that the hearsay exception covers that.
Objection overruled. You can proceed.
What were these symptoms?
Like I said, they were reflecting intoxication, slurred speech, nausea, vomiting, and these symptoms were confirmed when Miss Petrillo told me that she'd been drinking that night.
And what was your initial response to this assessment?
Since the symptom complex seemed to be indicative of alcohol poisoning, that was my initial diagnosis at the time.
So what did you do?
I admitted the patient to the hospital so that I could conduct a full examination. And it's here at this examination stage that we either confirm our initial diagnosis and we move forward with that treatment, or we uncover more clues as to what's really going on with the patient.
And what did your examination reveal?
I noticed several symptoms that are inconsistent with alcohol poisoning, and that caused me to ultimately amend my initial diagnosis. Some of the things this examination revealed, instead of having dilated pupils and the rapid pulse that we see in alcohol poisoning cases, Ms. Petrio's pupils were severely contracted and her pulse was very slow. She was also experiencing muscle spasms, incontinence, and respiratory constriction to the point that it was very difficult for her to breathe. And this whole symptom complex is uncommon in alcohol poisoning cases.
What was your next step?
Well, with this new diagnosis in the works, I ordered a toxins analysis because I started to suspect organophosphate poisoning. This is caused by the presence of pesticides in the body, and they're very, very dangerous chemicals, and they can be lethal even in the smallest doses. So I couldn't afford to wait until the test results came back. At this point, I decided to administer the antidote to the poison in an attempt to save her life.
Did the antidote work?
Unfortunately, the effects of the poison had progressed to the point that the patient could not be saved. The poison had gotten into her lungs and had caused her bronchial muscles to contract, making it so that oxygen couldn't get through her lungs to the rest of the body and even to her brain. After administering the antidote, the poison had already progressed into the nervous system as well, which causes neurological distress. It was at this point that Ms. Petrillo suffered from a seizure and fell into a coma. And she never regained consciousness from that, and she did pass early that morning.
What did you determine the cause of death to be?
Organophosphate poisoning. Between the symptoms that I observed and the toxicology results, I was confident that this was the correct diagnosis, and I wrote that on her death certificate.
Would you recognize those results if I show them to you today?
Yes, ma'am, I would.
Let the record reflect that I am approaching the witness with what has already been pre-admitted as exhibits 6 and 7. Can I share my screen?
Yes. So I'll reflect in the record.
Doctor, do you recognize these documents?
Yes, that is the patient's toxicology report.
Are these clear and accurate copies of these documents?
Yes, this one seems to be clear and accurate.
So how did you use these to confirm your diagnosis?
Well, if we can see that the results came back positive for organophosphate poisoning. It says so right here under the positive flagged results. So that's what really confirmed my diagnosis.
And were these tests able to determine how pesticides ended up in Genesis Petrillo's body?
In a way, they were. We tested everything that we could to identify the vehicle for the poison, and none of the food that was in her stomach tested positive for organophosphates. The only things left in there after we tested the food remnants were the wine and the pesticides. So I think that it's able to conclude that the organophosphate most likely entered her body via contaminated wine.
Thank you, doctor. No further questions.
All right, Mr. Kanduri, you may proceed with cross.
Yes, Your Honor. Good evening, Dr. Kwan.
Hello.
Now, when you first examined Ms. Petrillo, she exhibits symptoms of alcohol poisoning, yes?
Yes, that's correct.
She was vomiting.
She was.
She had slurred speech.
She did, yes.
She even smelled of alcohol, right?
She did. She smelled like wine.
And in fact, given these symptoms, you initially assumed that it was alcohol poisoning.
Yeah, that was my initial diagnosis before I saw all of the symptoms, yes.
That's right. You later changed your opinion, right?
Yes, once I had more information, yes.
Then you believe that Genesis had ingested an organophosphate toxin.
Yes, sir.
But isn't it true that organophosphate toxins cause rashes where they make contact with the skin?
Yes, but that isn't the only way that the poison could have been ingested. I believe it was actually ingested rather than contact spread through the skin.
Well,
so that would be why a rash wouldn't show up.
If someone were to ingest toxins, they would have to make contact with their mouth, yes?
Yes, most likely.
And there were no rashes on her lips.
Not to my knowledge, I did not see any at the time.
Not on her tongue,
I did not see any, no.
or anywhere in her mouth, for a matter of fact.
That's correct.
Now, you believe that lab data supports your conclusion that Genesis died by organophosphate poisoning, yes?
Yes, that's correct.
But this lab data has no information on how Genesis came into contact, does it?
That's correct.
It also has no information on how much toxin was in her system.
That's correct. There's no way to tell once it's been ingested because even the smallest amount can have these lethal effects.
But it still cannot give any exact quantities, can it?
Right, we don't have a volume in milliliters or anything written on it. That's correct.
I would like to direct your attention to the bottle of Caro wine. You believe that Genesis was poisoned by pesticides in that bottle, right?
Yes, that's correct.
But that bottle was found at a dumpster, wasn't it?
I believe it was, yes.
So it's contaminated evidence.
I'm not really qualified, I think, to talk about the standard of evidence. I'm not a police officer or anything like that. I'm just a doctor. I do the science.
So you can't tell us if contents in that bottle were there intentionally or accidentally, can you?
No, I can't. I can only tell you what the cause of death was, and the cause of death was the organophosphate poisoning.
And Dr. Kwan, did you ever have access to Genesis's medical history?
No, I did not. Sometimes things get mixed up in hospitals. It was very difficult to get, it's difficult to get records over in time. And then once Ms. Petrillo passed, there was no need for the records.
Well, when determining her cause of death, you still didn't have access to her medical records, did you?
That's correct.
So you have no idea what pre-existing conditions Genesis had.
I didn't see any evidence of any pre-existing conditions during the examination, but if there was something written in the medical records, you're right. I didn't have access to that.
So if she had pre-existing conditions, you had no idea how they would affect her if she ingested toxins, would you?
Since I don't know the exact name of any potential underlying conditions, I suppose that's true. Again, I didn't see any evidence of any underlying conditions, so I wasn't too concerned about it during my treatment of Ms. Petrillo.
Now, I'd like to talk about your treatment for Genesis. You believe her ultimate cause of death was respiratory failure, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, Dr. Kwan, did you ever administer a ventilator?
No, because at that point, the antidote was the most important treatment. That was what would work much faster than a ventilator, and unfortunately, it had been too late at that point.
But ventilators exist specifically to make a patient breathe when they can't on their own, yes?
Yes, that is the purpose of a ventilator.
You still did administer one for Genesis.
That's correct. I chose to administer the antidote.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Thank you. Any redirect, Ms. Garza?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Kwan. That's all you may be excused. Plaintiffs, call your next witness.
The plaintiff calls Casey Soto to the stand.
Ms. Soto, please take the stand.
Introduce yourself to the jury.
My name is Casey Soto.
Casey, I understand you suffered a loss. Let me know if you need a moment at any point in my questioning, okay? Could you tell me how you and Genesis met?
Yes, of course. Me and Genesis, we met at Rosie and Pedro's winery. We immediately hit it off and gosh, just sparks flew. We officially started dating about a month later. We had been inseparable since, that is until now.
How was your relationship with Genesis?
It was amazing. She brought out the best in me, and I admired that most about her. She was always so bold, life of the party, you know? She actually had ended up proposed to me, which I had been planning to, but she beat me to it. So I guess she was just as excited to start our lives together as I was.
Now, Casey, how did the wedding planning go?
The wedding planning was a little hectic, I'll be honest. My mother and Genesis tended to not get along. So there was arguments and complaints and disagreements that I just had to be stuck in the middle of. it seemed that my mom was determined to make sure the wedding just didn't happen. They would argue so much that I would just have to leave the room. It was really ridiculous.
But did their relationship seem to get any better before the wedding?
No, not at all. See, me and Genesis, we wanted this wedding to be about us. And my mom kept on butting into our plans. My mom seemed to be under the impression that I was going to be taking over the family winery, Peony Estates, but I had no intention of doing so. Me and Genesis had planned on going to France following the wedding.
And did the defendant know about this plan to move to France?
Yes, she did.
How did she react?
Well, I wasn't planning on telling my mom so soon about the wedding or about the plan to move to France, but I was actually planning on telling her after the wedding to just avoid having a giant argument face to face. I wanted to be as far away from her as possible to bear the bad news, but Genesis unfortunately told her through a voicemail that of our plans to move, and she reacted in the way of saying, whether you stay with Casey, move to France, I don't care, but if you end up 6 feet under, I don't care, but Casey is staying here.
I'd like to step forward and talk about the day of the wedding rehearsal. How did the rehearsal go?
I was really tense about all of the disagreements that had been going on. I was really nervous, and the first part of the wedding rehearsal was pretty enjoyable. Everybody seemed to be having a good time. Genesis was beautiful, as always. Gosh, she just lit up the whole room. But it took a really big turn whenever the toast started happening.
How did the night wrap up for you, Casey?
I went to bed pretty early. I wanted to be well rested for the big day. I kissed Genesis goodnight. She decided to stay up and enjoy the party. But that was actually the last time I saw her alive.
Do you need a moment?
I think I'm okay.
Casey, what did you do when you woke up the next morning?
Well, I was getting ready. I had my entire suit on, and Angel came in my room. She was really distraught, and she described to me where Genesis had gone. I couldn't tell you exactly what she said, honestly. I just remember her saying Genesis, coma, pesticide. I don't know. I was in such a rush to try to make it to the hospital in time.
Did you make it to the hospital in time to see Genesis?
No, I didn't. I was 5 minutes too late. 5 minutes, God. What I would give to get those 5 minutes back. I just broke down in tears. I didn't know what to say. I just never got to say goodbye.
No further questions. I pass the witness.
Thank you. Mr. York, you may proceed.
Good morning, Ms. Soda.
Good morning.
Growing up, Miss Martini, she was a good mom, right?
I mean, yeah,
She cared about you,
from what it seemed like, yes, she did.
and she sacrificed a lot of her time for your happiness.
It was just me and her, so a lot of her time was also mine.
She would make it to every one of your soccer games
Yeah, she did.
and your school plays.
Yeah, she was there.
Now, I'd like to talk about your wedding. Your mom offered to host it at her winery, Peony Estates.
She did offer.
She even offered to fund a large part of the wedding.
Yes, that was probably due to the fact that me and Genesis were a little hesitant to have it at her winery. We wanted to have it at the Rosie and Pedro winery where we met, but we eventually agreed to have it at my mother's winery.
She even thought your wedding could generate good publicity for Peony Estates.
Objection, speculation.
Response, Mr. York?
Yes, Your Honor. Miss Martini offered to host the wedding at Peony Estates out of goodwill for her daughter, but also out of a business opportunity, and Miss Soto is aware of this.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes, please.
Opposing counsel's question specifically said that the defendant thought and then provided the motive for why the defendant would host the wedding. It's asking my witness to delve into the mindset of Harper Martini. Therefore, it is speculative.
Objection sustained. You can ask your question or lay more foundation, Mr. York, but at this time, it's sustained.
Understood.
Thank you. May proceed.
Miss Martini was concerned that the wedding went well, wasn't she?
Yes, she was.
She wouldn't want anything to mess up this big opportunity.
Objection, speculative again.
Response, Mr. York?
Might I ask for the opposing counsel to clarify? I'm a bit confused.
Go ahead, Mr.
So the wording in this question again was that the defendant was concerned about making sure that everything was going well. This is asking the witness to delve into the mindset of the defendant, what Harper Martini wants for the wedding.
Response, Mr. York?
I would just say again that Casey was there with Miss Martini, and Harper specifically said this to Casey as well.
Objection sustained. Continue, Mr. York.
Genesis eventually agreed to this arrangement for Peony Estates to host.
We thought that was saving the money for the venue, that we could use that whenever we went to France. So yes, we eventually both agreed.
And speaking of Genesis, you guys had a plan to move to France after the wedding.
Yes, we did.
And you didn't tell your mom about this plan?
I had planned, like I said, and previously, I had planned on telling her after the wedding to avoid any large disagreements before the wedding.
Now, I'd like to talk about the night of the rehearsal dinner. You saw Genesis receive a bottle of Cara wine.
Yes, I did.
And you also saw her pour 2 glasses of Cara wine.
Yes, I did see her pour 2 glasses.
And are you able to say Genesis was the only person to drink the Cara wine?
I'm not sure, honestly. It wouldn't have been the first time that she poured 2 glasses.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. Mr. Tinner, any redirect?
No, Your Honor, I just asked that my witness be allowed to be excused.
She's allowed. Thank you very much. Call your next witness, plaintiffs.
With that, the plaintiff closes the case in chief.
That plaintiff closes their case in chief. At this time, I see that that my instructions state that we are now able to take a 5-minute break. Does the defense wish to take a 5-minute break, or are they ready to go forward at this time?
Your Honor, we would like to take a 5-minute break.
Okay, so at this time, we'll take a 5-minute break. Please remember that the video is being publicly broadcast via YouTube live stream, and I will see everybody in 5 minutes. Thank you. now it's back up. Yeah. Okay, is everybody back and ready to go? Okay, we need to make sure the scoring judge is present.
I'm present.
Okay, we're ready to go. Thank you. If we're ready to go, defense, please call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, I call Austin Lewis to the stand.
Okay. Defense, ready? You ready to go? Go ahead, please.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
Hi, I'm Austin Lewis.
What do you do for a living?
I used to work at a winery called Rosie and Pedro's, but I'm currently trying to help run Peony Estates Winery amongst this pandemic. Do you know how hard that is?
Why is it so hard?
Well, not only do I have to worry about people catching COVID, I also have to worry about pests trying to eat our grapes since Peony Estates is right next to a swamp.
You said you worked at Rosie and Pedro's. What was your experience there like?
I mean, it wasn't too terrible, but I didn't like the owner, Danny Francasio, all that much, so that made working there a bit of a pain. I just didn't like how dishonest he was and some of the things he would do.
Did anything good come out of working at Rosie and Pedro's?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have to worry about keeping people safe from COVID back then or being right next to a swamp, but I definitely wouldn't go back because Danny is still there. But another good thing that came out of it was I got to meet Harper Martini.
How was your relationship with Miss Martini?
It's pretty good. We work really well together. We became close at Rosie and Pedro's, and she actually asked me to come work with her at the winery she was opening, Peony Estates. I was so excited that she asked me and jumped at the opportunity to get away from Danny Francasio.
What did your job at Peony Estates entail?
I'm the head winemaker at Peony Estates, so that means that I deal with most of the winemaking process while Harper deals with the more business side of things. Overall, it's such a fulfilling job, but some of the things about the job do make me feel like I've aged about 30 years. I just keep finding more and more gray hairs.
What do you mean by that?
Peony Estates doesn't have the most ideal location. It's right next to a swamp, which means that we have a bit of trouble with pests. This did bring two main problems to us: the pesticides to use, which pesticides we should use, and how to store the pesticides safely.
Let's talk about the first problem. What type of pesticide did Peony Estates use?
Initially, we tried using the organic methods to keep the pesticides away, but we soon realized that it wasn't effective enough. That's when Harper suggested that we should switch to chemical pesticides to keep the pests under control.
And did you end up switching to chemical pesticides?
Yes, we did. I initially had some doubts about the switch, but Harper was pretty insistent, and I did agree that since the organic pesticides weren't working, we needed to try and do something to solve the pesticide problem or the pest problem. This did bring some of its own problems, though.
What kind of problems?
Well, Peony Estates is built on a slope, which means that the pesticides we spray on the grapes would run off from the grapes at the top of the slope to the ones at the bottom of the slope, which would make them dangerous to eat because they would just be sitting in pesticides. But don't worry, I acted accordingly to make sure that this would not be a danger moving forward.
What did you do?
I roped off the bottom of the slope when it came time to harvest, because those were the grapes that had the possibility of being contaminated. Those grapes got thrown out every year, and we ended up throwing out about 20% of our grapes each year.
How do you know that the grapes got thrown out every year?
I personally oversaw the harvesting process. The only time I didn't personally see it was the 2018 harvest.
Do you know if the grapes from the 2018 harvest were thrown out?
Like I said, I wasn't there to personally oversee the process, but I did leave the operation in really good hands and feel certain that they were thrown out.
Were the rest of the grapes from the 2018 harvest used?
Yes, since the ones with the potential of being contaminated had been thrown out, the rest of the grapes were used in our 2019 wine production.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the second problem you mentioned earlier. How were pesticides stored at Peony Estates?
We had a couple different ways over the years, but our current place to store the pesticides is in a shed that I built that's 600 feet away from our production facilities.
Were these storage methods safe and reliable?
They were. We did get cited a few times, but these were just mistakes. We're pretty good about storing the pesticides.
And what were those citations about?
The main thing we got cited for was improper storage of pesticide, but we always fix the problems right away.
When you say improper storage of pesticides, what do you mean by that?
There were a couple instances of pesticide spray being left out, so we were cited for storing pesticides in the wrong area. And there was also another instance where we got cited for having pesticides in the bottling area, but that was a mistake. We were prepping to use them later that day.
Did anything besides citations ever occur during these inspections?
Yes, at one point during a May 2019 inspection, we were put on probationary status, but we were still allowed to conduct business like usual. We just had to fix whatever we were cited for, which we did right away.
Moving on, I want to talk more about Miss Martini. Did you ever see her poison any of the wine bottles?
No, I never saw Harper put pesticides into any of the wine bottles.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Desi, you may do cross. You know what? 1 second. I'm going to start giving around 10 or 15 seconds in between the cross and directs just to all the judges to properly do their scoring. Okay, just understand that. Okay. Okay, Mr. Desi, you may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. So you were at the Peony Estates the day of the wedding, correct?
The wedding rehearsal?
Yes.
No, I wasn't.
And so you couldn't tell us about what happened in the wedding rehearsal at Peony Estates, correct?
No, I couldn't because I wasn't there.
Correct. So you mentioned before you're an employee at Peony Estates
Yes, I'm the head winemaker there.
and you use pesticides at Peony Estates.
Yes, we do, but we take all the precautions that we need.
And to your knowledge, the defendant was aware of how the pesticides were used, correct?
Yes, but she didn't really deal with them. I was the one who mainly took control of the pesticide usage.
And to your knowledge, he was familiar with the pesticides, where the pesticides were stored, correct?
Yes.
And as a matter of fact, the defendant told you about that one time the Peony State employee accidentally ingested pesticides, correct?
Yes. Again, it was a mistake. It accidentally got left out, and no one else has ever gotten sick from drinking our wine before.
But the employee had left a glass out of wine while pesticides were being sprayed.
Yes, and I guess they just forgot to throw it away. Again, nothing like that has ever happened before.
Yes, but the defendant told you about the employee that drank the wine,
Yes,
and he only drank a little bit of wine,
that's true.
and the wine was contaminated with pesticides.
Yes, because like I said, I'm pretty sure it just got left out and someone forgot to throw the wine away.
And the employee got very sick.
Yes, but it was the only time anyone's ever gotten sick from drinking our wine, and we make sure that it would never happen again.
As a matter of fact, the employee almost died.
That's true, but luckily he didn't, and he's still with us today, so that's really great.
And the defendant told you that the pesticides couldn't be seen in the wine.
That's right.
And the pesticides couldn't be smelled in the wine.
Yeah, that's probably how the employee ended up accidentally drinking the wine.
And the defendant also said that he knew pesticides could be poisonous.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure most people know that though.
The defendant also told you that they knew that pesticides could also be fatal.
Yes, again, I'm pretty sure most people know that though.
So moving on, the defendant and Genesis Petrillo did not get along.
From what I heard, they didn't.
The defendant also told you repeatedly that she hated Genesis.
Yes, but I just figured it was standard in-law things, you know?
As a matter of fact, the defendant also said if she could push a button and make Genesis disappear, she would absolutely do so.
Yes, but again, I just figured it was standard in-law stuff, you know? The in-laws never think that anyone's good enough for their kid.
So is that a yes is that a yes to my question?
Yes.
No more questions, Your Honor. I pass the witness.
Thank you. Mr. York, any redirect?
No, Your Honor. I just asked that Ms. Lewis be able to step down from the stand.
Yes, of course. Let's give about 10 or 15 seconds before I ask plaintiffs to call or defense to call their next witness. Okay, defense, please call your next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. Defense calls Dr. Cannon to the stand.
Okay, thank you. You may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Good evening. Could you please introduce yourself to the court?
Good morning. My name is Dr. Red E. Cannon.
And Dr. Cannon, what do you do for a living?
Well, I'm a medical doctor and consultant that specializes in toxicology and pharmacology. I used to be the chief toxicologist at Massachusetts General Hospital in the 90s, later received a faculty position at Midlands Medical School in the 2000s.
And what educational background do you have to hold this position?
I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Medical School, in which I received my MD. It was a big step from my small little town down in the South.
And have you ever been published in your field of work?
Well, I have published several, and I mean several published articles and treatises on toxicology, medicine, and treatment. When you've been in the field as long as I have, you know a thing or two because you've seen a thing or two.
And Dr. Cannon, why are you here in court today?
I was hired by the defense to evaluate and review Dr. Jim and Kwan's findings, specifically about Genesis Petrillo's death.
And what materials did you have access to when working on today's case?
I had access to the poison analysis test, the death certificate of Genesis Petrillo, the official Midlands alcohol impairment chart, the chemical analysis for pesticides, but most importantly, I had access to Dr. Kwan's report and the affidavit of Angel Rodriguez.
And were these materials sufficient for you to come to your conclusions in today's case?
Yes, they were.
And what method did you use in your work on today's case?
I utilized the SPEC method. This stands for symptoms, possible exposures, and causes of death. I review each of these three components of a particular material report before evaluating its integrity and conclusions. It's a highly respected method for conducting reviews.
Now, I'd like to talk about the symptoms part of the SPEC method. How is it used in your work on today's case?
Well, I looked at the symptoms that Dr. Kwan listed in her report to determine whether the diagnosis was correct. Genesis was indeed vomiting, had constricted pupils, and labored breathing, which made me agree, well, at least partly with Dr. Kwan, that organophosphate were likely causing her symptoms.
Well, you said that you only agreed partly with Dr. Kwan. Why is that?
Well, Dr. Kwan seemed to confuse likely with certain. There was not enough evidence to prove that pesticides was certainly the reason behind her symptoms because crucial information like Genesis medical records were missing.
Dr. Cannon, I'd like to talk about your second part of the method, potential exposures. What does that entail?
Well, once I determine the symptoms, a diagnosis of sorts, I look at evidence to see what kind of exposures could have triggered that cause. In some cases, like genetic disorders, this answer is simple, but in this one, it was far more complicated.
Why is that?
Well, Dr. Kwan's conclusions were fine, but only if you were looking at the limited evidence he did. I took some key additional facts into consideration that Dr. Kwan apparently didn't at the time of making her report.
Well, what facts did you take into consideration that Dr. Kwan didn't?
I took into account where Genesis was before she died. She was at a winery where pesticides are used everywhere regularly. Having worked on many pesticide poisoning cases in the past, I know that even grapes, wine cellars, and numerous other surfaces are sprayed regularly with pesticides. This led me to a more nuanced analysis than Dr. Kwan's.
And how so?
Well, rather than drinking a poisoned wine, it's more like any brief surface that had pesticides causing enough toxicity to kill Genesis. Even by simple probability, there's still only one bottle of wine versus a million different surfaces that could have poisoned her.
And how does your analysis compare to Dr. Kwan's?
Well, mine is more accurate. I wouldn't be confident saying like Dr. Kwan did that the toxin came from the wine.
Hold on, Dr. Cannon. Is there an objection by plaintiffs?
Yes, Your Honor. I'm objecting to improper opinion. Proceed.
Explain yourself. Under what rule?
Under Rule 702C.
Okay. Explain
Your Honor, I believe Rule 702C goes to the methods of the witness, which he has gone into detail, and to testify that they were commonly used and highly respected in his field. Foundation for that opinion has been laid.
Response, Ms. Garza?
Yes, Your Honor. As the witness has failed to establish that his method is reliable, while he was asked whether his method was reliable, and he did say yes, the Supreme Court of Midlands handed down an expanded interpretation of Rule 702C in their case, Terra Readers Association of Midlands versus Merrill Dow. The holding states, in assessing reliability under Rule 702C, judges should consider whether the theory or technique has been or can be tested, whether it has been subjected to peer review and publication, whether it has a known error rate, and whether it has gained widespread acceptance within the field. And the witness has only established that the method is accepted in their field. The foundation was not laid to sufficiently testify that with a certainty of how Trio died.
Your Honor, may I briefly respond?
Yes, please.
It also says in the line before the last that there is no definitive checklist and that judges must make such assessments based on the totality of the circumstances. And we've clearly laid that there was widespread acceptance for this method within the field. And appealing to the admission of Dr. Kwan's testimony on a similar method, I believe that this method is also certainly admissible. There is more than enough foundation laid for its reliability.
Thank you. Objection overruled. You may continue.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Dr. Cannon, how does your analysis compare to Dr. Kwan's in this case?
Well, mine is more accurate. I wouldn't be confident saying, like Dr. Kwan did, that the toxin came from the wine. Proving pesticides weren't in other people's food isn't enough. You have to prove it wasn't in Genesis' food and that she couldn't have came into contact with any surfaces with pesticide.
Now, Dr. Kwan, I'd like to direct your attention to the last part of your method, cause of death. How did you apply that in today's case?
Well, I combined the details from both the findings and to make a holistic picture for why Miss Petrillo died. This big picture is the cause of death. And it was the details that weren't in the picture that were that concerned me.
And what details are those, Dr. Cannon?
Well, we don't know the level of organophosphates. We don't see a rash on her lips or mouth. And if the pesticides were ingested with wine, we'll be able to tell that. Well, we can't tell if the wine was in the food or the drink or in her stomach, and we don't have any data to exactly know how much pesticide was in her.
Well, Dr. Kwan, with so many details missing, what is your opinion on Dr. Kwan's conclusion?
Well, I believe Dr. Kwan's conclusion was hasty at best, but there was a far bigger mistake than what he made.
And what mistake was that, Dr. Cannon?
That is standard procedure. I reviewed Dr. Kwan's treatment methods for Genesis, and again, I found a major problem, particularly regarding the administration of a ventilator.
Well, why are you concerned about a ventilator?
Well, if Dr. Kwan is correct about the low ache levels causing breathing problems, then the ventilator should have been administered immediately. He didn't, and the ventilator could have saved Genesis' life.
Dr. Cannon, after looking at all the facts, data, and evidence, what is your expert conclusion as to Genesis's cause of death?
Well, I agree with Dr. Kwan that what poisoned Genesis is most likely pesticides, but I can say to a degree of certain scientific certainty that the explanation for how was poison in Genesis' system come into contact had to be accidentally come into contact with surfaces.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
All right, let's give just about 10 or 15 seconds for the judges to score, and then we'll begin with plaintiff's cross. Okay, Ms. Garza, you can proceed.
Dr. Cannon, you never met Genesis Petrillo, is that correct?
May you please repeat your question?
You never met Genesis Petrillo, is that correct?
No, ma'am, unfortunately, I did not.
And you never spoke to her, is that correct?
No, ma'am.
You never spoke to any of the wedding guests?
No, ma'am, I did not.
And you never spoke to Harper Martini?
No, ma'am, I did not speak to her as well.
You didn't even examine the body of Genesis?
No, ma'am, but my job was only to review Dr. Kwan's findings.
Yes, you only examined documents, isn't that correct?
This is correct.
Now, let's talk about the blood alcohol content. When examining the documents, you came to the conclusion that Ms. Petrillo could have died from alcohol poisoning, isn't that correct?
Well, while I didn't mention this on the stand, I did have some degree of methods in which I said it is a possible cause of alcohol poisoning.
You've seen cases where alcohol poisoning is lethal, correct?
Yes, ma'am, there are some lethalities in alcohol poisoning.
You've never seen a BAC of less than 0.3% be lethal, correct?
No, ma'am, but as that is, we don't know the peak level of Genesis Petrillo.
But by the time of her death, Ms. Petrillo only had a BAC of 0.16%, correct?
Yes, ma'am, this is correct, but unlike Dr. Kwan, he didn't take into consideration that BAC is not constant. And as a medical professional, this is something that you should take into consideration.
Thank you, doctor. You've never witnessed anyone dying of alcohol poisoning with a BAC of 0.16, correct?
No, ma'am, this is not likely.
There is no evidence that Petrillo's BAC was 0.3%.
No, ma'am, and there's no evidence that it wasn't.
In fact, yes, that is correct. There was no evidence that Petrillo's BAC approached 3%.
Oh, may you please repeat? Was that a question, ma'am? I'm sorry.
There is no evidence that Petrillo's BAC approached 3%. Is that correct?
No, ma'am, there's no evidence of this.
Alcohol poisoning does not explain the pesticide found in the victim's stomach contents.
No, ma'am, and I agree. Pesticides were most likely the cause, but we don't know what surface it came from.
Alcohol poisoning does not explain the pesticide found in the victim's blood.
This is correct, and as I said, pesticides were most likely the cause.
It is highly unlikely that the victim died of alcohol poisoning, correct?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Moving to the wine, you're aware that all of the leftover food and beverages from the rehearsal dinner were tested for pesticides.
Yes, ma'am, and this was after the dinner party. We haven't tested the food prior to Genesis eating it, so we don't know if she consumed pesticides from her food.
Thank you. And you're aware that all leftover food and beverages from the rehearsal dinner tested negative for pesticides.
Yes, all the ones that were left over.
To your knowledge, no other guests at the rehearsal dinner had any symptoms of pesticide poisoning.
This is true, but then again, Genesis was the only one that was poisoned, and her food wasn't tested prior to her consuming it.
Genesis Petrillo was the only person who died of pesticide poisoning from that rehearsal dinner that you know of.
This is correct.
Now, the cause of death, you would agree that respiratory arrest is the most likely cause of the victim's death.
Yes, ma'am, as I did view the death certificate, this was stated.
You would agree that the pesticide poisoning is most likely the cause of Petrillo's death.
Yes, ma'am, pesticide poisoning is the most likely reason, but we don't know what surface.
No further questions.
Okay, thank you. Is there any redirect?
No, Your Honor. I ask that Dr. Ken be allowed to step down from the stand.
Okay, granted. Let's wait another 10 or 15 seconds before ask defense if they have any more witnesses. Okay, defense, do you have any other witnesses to call?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Harper Martini to the stand.
Okay. You may proceed.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
Hi, my name is Harper Martini.
Ms. Martini, could you tell us about yourself?
Yeah, I'm originally from the Napa Valley area, but I moved to Midlands for college and I've been here ever since. Right now, the two most important things in my life are my winery with Peony Estates and my daughter, Casey.
We'll talk about Casey shortly. Could you tell us about your winery, Peony Estates?
Yeah, sure. I opened Peony Estates back in January 2015, and honestly, it's been the most wonderful and fulfilling career that I could have asked for. I truly love what I do. That being said, there have been some rough patches along the way.
What are the rough patches?
Well, winemaking is a pretty cutthroat industry. We're lucky because the environment does most of the work for us, but competition is stiff. Casey actually had this idea to add a bed and breakfast feature to help set us apart, and it was almost too good for business. We could barely keep up with booking demands.
Now, I want to talk to you about your daughter, Casey. Can you describe your relationship with her?
I'm a single mom, so naturally, Casey is my entire world. Growing up, we always had a pretty close relationship, and the best part of my days were writing Casey little notes to leave in her lunchbox before school. Obviously, we're a little past the lunchbox stage now, but we're still as close as ever. She's my perfect little girl, and honestly, her only flaw was her taste in women.
Could you elaborate on this flaw of Casey's?
Well, she had this one really awful girlfriend in high school, but most recently, I wasn't the biggest fan of her most recent partner, Genesis.
What concerned you about Casey and Genesis's relationship?
I mean, as a mother, I want the absolute best for Casey, and I didn't feel that Genesis was the best for her. Genesis was an awful influence and got Casey into all sorts of terrible situations. I mean, Casey was even hospitalized once for alcohol poisoning because of some bet that Genesis had made her.
Did Casey know how you felt towards Genesis?
Yeah, like I said, we have a pretty open relationship, and I had multiple conversations with her about it. I was pushing for Casey to find someone else, but they ended up getting engaged in 2018. I knew how much Casey had to love Genesis if she agreed to get married to her, so I decided that it was time to try and smooth things over with my relationship with Genesis.
What did you do to smooth things over?
I met up with Genesis to get dinner in January 2019. I just really wanted to have a good relationship with Casey's future wife, but it didn't work out quite as well as I hoped it would.
What happened?
Genesis mentioned something about a move while we were eating. I had no clue what she was talking about until a few months later when she left me a rather unpleasant voicemail about it.
Would you recognize a copy of that voicemail that was shown to you in court today?
Yes, absolutely.
At this time, the defense would like to share Exhibit 8, noting as per Stipulation 3 that this evidence is pre-admitted.
You may proceed.
Ms. Martini, why was the voicemail Genesis left you unpleasant?
Well, as you can see in the top left, it was left at 1 in the morning, and it sounded pretty hectic and all over the place. That night, I know Casey and Genesis had gone to some casino, and Genesis sounded like she was drunk when she recorded it. The last line in particular was really hurtful, but the rest basically said that her and Casey were moving to France, and I would never see either of them again.
Mr. York, could you please end sharing Exhibit 8? Ms. Martini, what was your response to this news?
I was shocked. As hurt as I was, I knew that Casey still loved Genesis and that she wouldn't change her mind. I'm not proud of it, but I made a last-ditch attempt to try and instead convince Genesis to call the wedding off.
And what was this last-ditch attempt?
I wrote her a note and I offered her some money.
Would you recognize a copy of this note if it was shown to you in court today?
Yes, I would.
The defense would like to share Exhibit 24. Ms. Martini, what is this?
That's a copy of the note that I gave to Genesis.
And is this a fair and accurate copy?
It is, yes.
Has it been changed in any way?
No, it doesn't look like it.
At this time, the defense enters Exhibit 24 into evidence.
Any objections?
Plaintiff has no objection.
So entered.
Can you tell the members of the jury about this note?
Like I said, it was definitely not my proudest moment. I felt that Genesis wasn't good for Casey, and out of hurt and anger, I scribbled this note to see if Genesis would be receptive to it. I also included $300,000. I figured that that amount of money would be enough to help her with her dream of moving to France while still calling the wedding off.
Mr. York, could you please end sharing Exhibit 24? Ms. Martini, did Genesis accept this offer from you?
No, she actually gave me the note back on June 7th, which was the day of the rehearsal dinner. And honestly, I was kind of relieved about it. I felt so much regret for writing her that note after seeing how happy Casey was the day of the rehearsal dinner.
Could you tell us what happened at the rehearsal dinner?
Yeah, after Genesis gave me that note back, I knew that she would officially be joining my family. I was so ashamed that it took me that long to accept it, but I decided to try and extend an olive branch to her in the hopes that she would agree to turn over a new leaf with me.
And what was this olive branch?
It was a bottle of Peony Estates' newest wine, Cara, and it had a really similar flavor profile to wines that Genesis had absolutely loved when we'd been sampling them during the wedding planning process. I had hoped that she would recognize the sentiment and that we could move forward stronger as a family.
Ms. Martini, are you aware that that bottle later tested positive for pesticides?
I am. I heard about that after everything happened. I feel so bad. I honestly don't know how that could have happened. The only thing I can think of is that around a year ago, we started using this chemical pesticide on our property to stop pests from eating our grapes. And we did use those grapes to produce our 2019 wine, including Cara.
Objection, speculation.
Respond.
Your Honor, this is within this witness's rationally based perception. She's the owner of Peony Estates. She would not speculate on whether their uses of pesticide would affect the way their grapes are going. I think she would have knowledge of whether this would affect the production of the wine.
Mr. Tinner?
Yeah, so the witness first started out that bit by saying that she doesn't know what would have happened. And although she is the owner of Peony Estates and would have some knowledge about the wine harvesting, this testimony has not specifically been tied to any rationally based perception.
Defense? Any response?
Yes, Your Honor. it is tied to rationally based perception because she did know that they used pesticides to grow the wine in 2019, which is what she gave to Genesis Petrillo. She doesn't exactly know exactly how it got in there, but she is providing an explanation for what she thinks best could fit.
Objection overruled. Proceed.
Going back to the rehearsal dinner, Miss Martini, did you ever give Genesis this bottle of wine?
Yeah, I actually had the caterer present it to her while I was giving a toast later that night. I acknowledged that we'd had a rocky past, but I was really hopeful for our future together, and I thought Genesis wanted the same. I turned in pretty soon after, but I woke up to some panicked phone call at around 2:30 the next morning.
And what was this panic phone call about?
Apparently, someone from Peony Estates was being rushed to the hospital. I'd seen Genesis drink a decent amount the night before, so I headed to her room to see if everything was okay. When I got there, she was nowhere to be found, but the bottle of Cara wine was on her floor, empty. Seeing this, I figured she drank too much, but I assumed that she would show up in time for the wedding still since it was so early.
Miss Martini, do you know what happened to Genesis Petrillo?
Yes. The next day, we found out that Genesis was in the hospital. Casey went right away while I stayed back to handle the guests that had started arriving for the wedding, but I later found out that Genesis had passed away.
You're here today because you're accused of causing Genesis Petrillo's death. What is your reaction to that?
Do you know how hard it is as a mother to see your only child grieve the death of her soon-to-be wife on the day that they were supposed to get married? Because I do, and I would never wish anyone to experience pain like that in their lives. It is absolutely heartbreaking to think that some people think I would inflict that pain on Casey. I would never hurt Genesis, let alone kill her.
Thank you, Miss Martini. No further questions, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Let's wait 10 or 15 seconds for judges scoring to take place, and then we'll start with cross. Okay, Mr. Tinner, you may proceed.
Ms. Martini, you mentioned on direct examination that you offered some money to Genesis. Isn't that correct?
I did, yes.
You gave that money to Genesis in an envelope?
Yes, along with the note.
And you would recognize that note if you saw it in court today?
I would, yes.
Permission to tender to opposing counsel and the witness in turn what has been marked as Exhibit 24, which has also been entered into evidence by defense counsel.
Granted.
This is the note you wrote to Genesis, isn't it?
It is, yes.
That's your handwriting on the note?
Yes, it is.
And you signed the bottom of that note with your initials, HM, correct?
I did.
Now, in this note, you wrote, leave Casey and the enclosed $300,000 is yours. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's what I wrote.
And the check in the envelope with the note was for $300,000, correct?
Yes, I had hoped that it would be enough money that she would consider moving to France and calling the wedding off.
Now, let's talk about the night of the wedding rehearsal. You gave some toasts, right?
I did.
One of them was at 10 p.m.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Each member of the wedding party was given a bottle of wine.
Yes, I had everyone receive a bottle of Horizon wine, but because I wanted to smooth things over with Genesis, I gave her a special bottle, Cara.
And you left the wedding rehearsal around 10:30 p.m.?
Yeah, I wanted to turn in pretty early so I could wake up in time for the wedding the next morning.
Right. And on direct, you mentioned that you got a call the next morning, right?
Yeah, I did.
That call was around 2:30 a.m.?
It was.
It was from one of your employees?
Yes, it was.
And this employee told you that someone had been rushed to the hospital.
That's true.
Yes or no, did the employee tell you who had been rushed to the hospital?
No.
You talked to Angel Rodriguez later that morning, though, right?
Yeah, I think Angel came by at around 7 or 8 in the morning, maybe.
Okay. And it was at that time that Miss Rodriguez informed you of something, right?
I believe Miss Rodriguez said that Genesis was in the hospital, and at that point, since I had seen the empty bottle of wine on Genesis's room floor, I assumed it was because she was there for alcohol poisoning.
No further questions.
Okay, anything redirect?
Brief redirect, Your Honor.
Okay, give 1 second, about 10 seconds to allow judging take place, please. Okay, we proceed.
Ms. Martini, I'd like to talk to you one more time about that note you wrote to Genesis Petrillo. Why did you write that note?
Again, I'm not proud of it at all, but I wrote it because I didn't think that Genesis was a good fit for Casey. I didn't want Casey to end up in a relationship where she was always getting bet to do something and ended up in the hospital the next morning. So I wrote Genesis that note in the hopes that she would be the one to call the wedding off and maybe start a new life in France with the money that I gave her.
No further questions, Your Honor. I ask this witness be excused.
Thank you. Let's give a few seconds for judging scoring, please. Okay, I have some instructions. Let me just get them up so I can read them. I'm sorry. Does plaintiff have, does defense have any more witnesses?
No, Your Honor. At this time, the defense rests our case in chief.
Okay.
We also would like to request a brief 5-minute break before proceeding to closing arguments.
Okay, does defense close? Defense rests and close, correct?
Yes.
And does plaintiff, a close also, correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. You requested 5 minutes, you said?
Yes.
Okay, no problem. We'll get 5 minutes before we come for closing.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Okay, is everybody ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay,
Plaintiff case is ready.
okay. Defense, are you there?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, do we have our judges? Our scoring judges, Mark and Luke?
I'm here.
Okay.
I'm here as well.
All right, fantastic. So we will now hear closing arguments from each party. Everyone should please switch back to speaker view. Plaintiffs, you have the burden. You will go first. Whenever you're ready, you may proceed.
Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. On June 7th, at a wedding rehearsal, the defendant, armed with a bottle of pesticides, stepped into the kitchen and poisoned a bottle of Cara wine. The defendant walked in with poison, walked out with wine. That same evening, the defendant gave a toast and gifted Genesis Petrillo that bottle of poisoned wine. Genesis drank that wine and died. It's for this reason that the estate of Genesis Petrillo has brought a complaint of battery against the defendant. Now, it's your job as the jury to answer this question, while it is our job as the plaintiff to prove it to you. We had to prove to you that the defendant acted with an intent to cause harmful or offensive contact, and that harmful or offensive contact occurred. Now, what does that mean in today's case? We had to prove to you that the defendant gave Genesis poisoned wine, intending to harm Genesis, and that Genesis was harmed. We had to prove all this to you, members of the jury, by a preponderance of the evidence. We needed to show you that more likely than not, the defendant committed battery. And members of the jury, we have met our burden. So let's review the evidence that we brought today to help you arrive at the truth. The defendant's first approach to dealing with Genesis was not to poison her. In fact, the defendant had 3 plans in mind, and members of the jury, remembering these plans is as simple as A, B, C. Plan A, antagonize. Plan B, bribe. Plan C, Cara. So let's take these plans in turn as we consider the months, weeks, days, and hours that led up to the wedding rehearsal where the defendant walked in with poison, walked out with wine. Plan A, antagonize. To start with, the defendant antagonized Genesis. Just consider some of these things that the defendant said to Genesis. First, the defendant said, "Leave and save this family the headache, otherwise I will make you disappear." Or how about when the defendant said, "Whether you stay with Casey, move off to France, or end up 6 feet under, I don't care." And as Casey and Angel both told you today when they took the stand, the defendant antagonized Genesis throughout the months of wedding planning and even encouraged Casey not to go through with the wedding. Members of the jury, what does all this mean? Well, at first, the defendant tried to use her words to get Genesis out of Casey's life, to get Genesis out of the picture. But this plan did not work. Genesis was still there, so the defendant moved on to the next plan. Plan B, bribe. Members of the jury, we saw this note along with a check in an envelope for $300,000 that the defendant gave to Genesis within weeks of the wedding. Now, the defendant tried to explain this by saying that she was just offering some money. Members of the jury, offering some money is a bribe. And she said that she was giving the money to Genesis to go to France. But what she didn't tell you was that was to get Genesis out of the picture. And as the note also says clearly, it says, "If you haven't left by June 7th, I will take you out of the picture the hard way." June 7th rolled around, the evening of the wedding rehearsal. Genesis was still there. So the defendant moved on to Plan C. Kara. Plan C, Kara. The night of the wedding rehearsal, the defendant yanked Genesis out into the hallway to have a word. And later that evening, Angel Rodriguez saw the defendant walking towards the kitchen with a canister of pesticides. When Angel Rodriguez stopped the defendant to ask what was happening, the defendant responded, "These pesticides are for Genesis, because Genesis is such a pest." Now, members of the jury, she confessed. When the defendant walked into that kitchen, the defendant did exactly what she said she was going to do. She made good on her threats, and she poisoned that bottle of Kara wine. Later that evening, she gave that bottle of wine to Genesis. Genesis and only Genesis drank that bottle of Kara wine, and Genesis died later that evening. Our attending physician told you to a reasonable degree of medical certainty that Genesis died from pesticide poisoning. The defense brought their own expert too, who agreed that most likely Genesis died from pesticide poisoning. There's no disagreement there. Genesis died because the defendant had a Plan C, Kara, and members of the jury, that plan worked. Now, as the defense said during their trial, there was no intent, it's an accident. Members of the jury, we proved to you intent. This was no accident. And let's consider what one of their own witnesses said when they took the stand. They brought an employee of Peony Estates, Austin Lewis, to the stand, who testified that time and again, when Peony Estates had problems with their operations, they did everything in their power to fix these problems so that no one who drank Peony Estates wine would get sick. Their own witness told you that Peony Estates was not negligent as a business. This was not an accident. Members of the jury, you're about to be taken back to a room where you'll be allowed to review all the facts and deliberate. We ask that as you look at the evidence, you consider that the defendant walked in with poison and walked out with wine. We are confident that as you review all of the facts that we've brought to you today, you will be able to reach the reasonable conclusion. We ask that you find the defendant liable for battery. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kenner. Before we start defense, let's give about 10 or 15 seconds for judging, scoring. Okay, defense closing. You may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Before I begin, I'd like to verify that you can see and hear me correctly.
I can see and hear you, yes.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. There is no intent in an accident. Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury. We are here today because my client, Harper Martini, has been wrongfully accused of battery by the plaintiff. Now, they came here, they tried to blame Miss Martini for the death of Genesis Petrillo. They said that she killed Miss Petrillo because she walked in with a poison and walked out with a wine. And while this is certainly a convenient story, it overlooks the inconvenient truth that was proven today. Members of the jury, it's true that Genesis and Harper had their disagreements. It's true that Genesis's death was poignant and tragic, but members of the jury, it is equally true that what killed Genesis was not an attack from Harper Martini, it was an accident from Peony Estates. Now, as the defense in today's case, we don't bear the burden of proof. That lies solely on the plaintiff's shoulders. They must prove by a preponderance of the evidence that Miss Martini intended to harm Genesis and that what killed Genesis was a wine poisoned by Miss Martini. Now, that doesn't mean that their case has to be downright impossible. Even if you think that any one of those two elements is more likely than not to be untrue, you must find Miss Martini to be not liable. Now, members of the jury, you heard the testimony, you've seen the evidence, and now you know the truth. Miss Martini raised her daughter, Casey Soto, as a single mother. She told us that she made every commitment she could to be her best possible mother for Casey. Going to her soccer games, watching her rehearsals, even if Casey wasn't the lead. So in 2015, when Harper opened her winery venture, Peony Estates, Casey was right there with her, opening a bed and breakfast service, managing the property, helping her mother realize her dreams as her mother had helped her. But Miss Martini herself told us that there was some rough patches in the relationship. In 2018, Genesis Petrillo proposed to Casey and they were engaged to be married. But when Miss Martini found out that Casey was going to marry the person who'd gotten her hospitalized for a bet, who badmouthed Harper openly, who snidely criticized Harper's business, she did what any mother would. She simply advised against it. She never held a grudge. In fact, we heard from Miss Martini herself that she wanted to turn over a new leaf with her daughter's fiance, so she invited Genesis to dinner. But members of the jury, we heard that soon after, while she was drunk and vomiting in the bathroom, Genesis left Harper a surprise, a voicemail that said she and Casey were moving away to France, whether or not Harper liked it. But even when Genesis was making things difficult, Harper didn't stop trying to find a peaceful solution for everyone. You see, even after hearing this shocking news, all Harper did was to ask Genesis to leave, and that she was willing to pay Genesis out of her own pocket to leave her family alone. Members of the jury, we heard today that she was ashamed to ask even that because of how it affected her relationship with Genesis and Casey. So for her to kill Genesis, as the plaintiff alleges, that doesn't add up. Now later, Genesis and Petrillo were engaged, and by 2019, they were going to get married at Peony Estates. But even at this time, after Genesis rejected Harper's offer, Harper accepted Genesis into her family. We heard that she took it out of her own pocket to make sure that Genesis and Casey's wedding went perfectly. She gave a touching toast to Genesis on the day before their wedding. And to symbolize the new beginning between her and Genesis, she gave her a special bottle of Cara wine. But before this new beginning had a chance to take shape, Genesis tragically passed away. Now, members of the jury, if you notice, these events are all the plaintiff could afford to talk about, but you know the whole truth, that at the same time that the conflicts in Harper's family were brewing, so was the real cause of Genesis's death. You heard how competitive the Woodlands winemaking market is. You heard that Peony Estates is located right above a swamp, and that didn't make making wines easy. We heard from Austin Lewis that just in their first year, they received a warning from the health inspector about pesticide safety. And when Peony Estates switched from organic to chemical pesticides, their problems switched from bad to worse. And by the time Genesis and Casey were to get married in 2019, Peony Estates' pesticide problems were tragically beyond repair. We heard from Austin Lewis that they were cited by the health inspector for 4 different health code violations, all relating to their pesticide practices and the high risk of contamination of their wines. But we also heard that nobody at Peony Estates, not Austin, not Harper, wanted this to happen, because the fact is there is no intent in an accident. In fact, we heard from Dr. Kwan that we don't even know how much pesticide was in Genesis Petrillo when she died. We heard that all the surfaces at Peony Estates, the grapes, the wine cellar, were all more likely to have caused pesticide poisoning than any wine. In fact, Dr. Cannon pointed out that Dr. Kwan, their expert, failed to mention important details that the plaintiff failed to mention as well, because members of the jury, their case falls apart when they have to contend with the whole truth. Now, when you go into that jury room today, you have to make a verdict on what is more likely. And members of the jury, I ask you just that. What is more likely? Is it likely that Harper killed Genesis because she walked in with a poison and walked out with a wine? Because so did Austin Lewis. So did every employee at Peony Estates, because that's their job as employees at a winery. None of them are on trial for battery. Moreover, if she walked in with a pesticide and walked out with a wine, that says nothing about intent. The plaintiff said nothing about intent because the fact of the matter is there is no intent in an accident. Or members of the jury, is it more likely that after years of problematic pesticide practices, an accident that was inevitable to happen finally did? It resulted in the tragic death of Genesis Petrillo. Is it likely that after attempt, solution after solution, Harper really did have nothing to do with Genesis Petrillo's death? Your Honor, members of the jury, it is clear there is no intent in an accident, no matter how tragic. And for that reason, I ask that you find Harper Martini not liable for battery. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Plaintiffs, it looks like you have I think you had 1:30 for rebuttal. Do you wish to use that?
Yes, a brief rebuttal, Your Honor.
Okay. You have about 10 or 15 seconds before I have you start so that the scoring judges can complete their job, okay? Okay, you may begin.
May it please the court. When the closing attorney got up here for the defense's side, he attempted to explain the defendant's behavior by saying, "She did what any mother would." Now, I just want to ask for clarification. What did the defendant do that any mother would? Was it the antagonizing? Was it the offer of a bribe? Was it when the defendant gave a poisoned bottle of Cara wine to the victim, Genesis Petrillo? Members of the jury, we brought you the facts, and we met our burden of proof. We proved intent. This was no accident. Now, defense got up here and told you one story. Their witnesses told you a different story. For this reason, we ask that you define the defendant liable for battery. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Judges will now submit their ballots. I ask everyone to stay on until everyone has submitted their ballots, and then we'll do brief comments. So just stand by, okay? I guess judges, once you submitted your ballots, can you please just indicate that to me privately on the chat so that I can see if the tournament staff has received them, and then we can do brief oral comments. Thank you. Okay, judges have submitted their ballots. I'm just waiting on confirmation from the tournament staff that they've been received, and then we'll have brief comments. Hold on. Okay, ballots have been received. I don't know, Mark and Luke, if you can get on and if everybody, so we at least see your faces and stuff. So all the other participants, so that we can see everybody on screen. I mean, I'll let Mark and Luke talk. Just from me personally, I want to tell everybody they did a fantastic job. It was very impressive. I can't imagine the stress of everybody doing this from home and not being in front of in front of an audience, you know, and your teammates, and just the anxiety and the stress and the emotion really plays a big part in all this. But everybody did really good, fantastic jobs. I was able to hear everybody. You guys navigated everything very clearly. I mean, I have nothing but just praise to sing for all of you. So you all did a great job. I'll let I guess on my screen, Mark's the first guy I see on my screen. So Mark, if you can go ahead and do some comments and see what you guys thought about everybody.
I can certainly try. Just a brief explanation of who I am. I'm Mark Stallman. I'm a 1L at Baylor Law. I did mock trial for 2 years with Texas A&M. This is my first tournament ever to judge, so do with that what you will. For me, I thought, especially given the time constraints and given the issues of trying to present this over Zoom with so many limitations on evidence and so many limitations on how you can move. I mean, I'm astounded that y'all have done as well as y'all have. It was a pleasure to watch. My positive comments are in my comment sheet. If I had to point out one thing from each side, defense, very good job of presenting an alternative theory. Careful you don't present more than one. There was a discussion of, it wasn't really an alternative theory, but there was a discussion of like a ventilator issue with the doctor. I'm not sure where that came into play. I don't know if I would include that personally, but it was very good. Very good attack of the elements. And then plaintiff, good organization of the timeline. Pulling out the timeline of the events was very helpful for me to understand kind of, you know, what the actual issue was and why it may have all of a sudden escalated to what you're alleging. What I would say is that there needs to be sort of a clearer definition of what the elements are. As far as, you know, for me, I need a bit more of like, here's the, you know, there's intent and here's what the intent is. And then it caused some part, I need a bit more getting into that, because we were jumping around to statements and jumping around to issues like, you know, that led up before it, which were important to understanding like the emotional impact, but I struggled to see how they tied into what I would have to answer as a juror. Other than that, it was good. I very much enjoyed the witnesses. Y'all did great. I did experts on my team, so experts, many props to y'all. Y'all were incredible. Other than that, yeah, it was good. Very well done.
Thank you. Luke?
All right, so how are y'all doing? I'm a 3L at Baylor Law School. And so let's talk. So I think it was really good. You were very professional. And I thought all the witnesses did a phenomenal job with their characters. Echoing kind of Mark's comment, I definitely think you could have done a little bit more throughout the process of emphasizing those elements. And kind of leading into that, one of my biggest problems with the presentation was the lack of visual aids. So y'all didn't use many exhibits or demonstratives. So as an ordinary juror who hasn't lived with this problem like you have, I'm kind of sitting there going, okay, I understand. I'm hearing some phrases, but I don't have any visuals to back it up. And not everyone's an auditory learner. Some people are very visual. And so making a list of the different elements and making a PowerPoint slide and putting it up there really helps me. Giving me a physical timeline really helps me. Even making the points, like having a PowerPoint that reveals each point you're having your witness make as they're making them, is a nice demonstrative to help the jury kind of look back and go, okay, those were the points that witness made. So I would definitely incorporate more of that. I definitely think it would make your presentation that much stronger. Otherwise, at some point, I kind of felt like you turned into talking heads, which is like one word, one word, one word. And after too long a time, this is pretty condensed, but especially with longer trials or things, it gets really, really just hard to follow. Let's see, another comment I had, y'all did pretty good with hearsay. Just remember, hearsays are out of court statements offered for the truth of the matter asserted. So make sure you're watching out for those hearsay objections. There are a couple documents that got in that I think you probably should have raised a hearsay objection for, because they are out of court statements and you're offering them to prove their contents. And the other side probably should have thrown up a hearsay objection, just at least to maybe contest it a little bit. Also, two things. If it's a photograph, it's true and correct copy. True and correct copy if it's a writing, fair and accurate depiction if it's a photograph. So just make sure you're laying the right predicate for whether it's a writing or a photograph or image. Just make sure you're watching your predicate there. Last comment, openings. I thought the openings were pretty good. The only thing I would suggest from the plaintiff side is the bad facts. As a juror, I was kind of thinking, okay, what are the bad things about their case? And I don't think you really addressed the bad things, and it kind of allowed the defense to come in and say, well, here's what they didn't tell you. And that's kind of a, uh-oh, because the jury now is like, ooh, well, they just lied to me, or ooh, they just kind of hid some facts. Let's find out what's the real truth. So maybe even showing it from the defendant's perspective as you walk through the timeline instead of the victims would help sort of show those bad facts and help the jury not feel like there's a gotcha that they can anticipate. But other than that, I thought you all did really good.
Fantastic. I think the only comment other than that on exactly what everybody was doing, and my background, I've been an attorney for 19 years or so. I was a prosecutor and a defense attorney. I think with the limited structure of this too, I think you guys could have used leading questions better. Nobody really asked leading questions, and the witnesses were all really great on both sides, and they just kind of rambled a little bit. When you're crossing, I mean, isn't this correct? Isn't this right? Yes or no? This is what's going on. I mean, boom, boom, get them in and out fast. You can. You with this limited time frame, I think you could have hit that pretty good. There's a couple. I forgot who they were, but they were very open-ended questions. Just use your leading questions more on cross. Get your points, hit it hard, get out. I think that could have been an advantage in this time constraint system. But you guys did awesome. I mean, I can't tell you that I've been seeing attorney practice for 20 years and all you guys are better than them right now. So good job, everybody. Okay. Are there any questions to anyone else, to any of us, from any of the participants? Any questions? No. If not, that's about it. I don't know when your next round is, but we're all able to log off, and good luck in the tournament. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.